Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Yo Seal. I'm a Senior Scientific Engineering Associate at Berkeley Lab in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department, and I have the pleasure to present today some of our recent research on hybrid power plants, together with my colleague Will Gorman. Both of us have studied at the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley. I completed my PhD there a few years ago, while Will is currently wrapping up his doctoral studies there. And we both do research on the integration of variable generation resources into the electric power system, and focus today specifically on the application of energy storage in conjunction with wind and solar and energy storage in the form of batteries. And that is the research area that Will has come to lead in our group over the past few years. So a few organizational remarks at the beginning. All attendees will remain muted during today's presentation, but that does not mean that we do not want to hear from you. So please do use the Q&A functionality in the chat box to send us any questions that you may have, and that we will then try to answer towards the end of the hour. You can also upvote questions of others there if you'd like us to discuss, for example, a particular topic. Today's slides are going to be posted at the website that is shown here on this title page. And we will also upload a video recording of today's presentation in case you need to drop off before we conclude today. So today's presentation is going to be a little bit different from our usual Berkeley Lab webinars. Normally, we dive deep into a single research question that we then study for a course of a year, and on which we then publish a longer technical report, sometimes accompanied by a scientific journal article. But today we want to present instead a summary of 13 different reports that we released over the past few years, and that all deal with the emerging sector of hybrid power plants in the United States. And we wanted to make our research a little bit more accessible and release thus a short and maybe a bit more digestible paper of our top 10 findings in this research area. And this paper you can also download at the link that is shown here on this slide. We are thus not the sole intellectual owners of this work, but instead stand on the shoulders of our many colleagues at the Electricity Markets and Policy Department who have either led individual papers or have contributed very actively to them. And so that is Galen Babose, Mark Bollinger, Cristina Crespo-Montañez, Sydney Forrester, James Hyung-Kwan Kim, Fritz Kahl, Andrew Mills, Deb Milstein, Ben Paulus, Joe Rand, and Cody Warner, and our group lead, Ryan Weiser. For each of the research findings of their papers that we will discuss today, we will provide links for you to dive deeper into our methods and findings of that particular paper. And we also provide the specific contact details of our research lead, should you have any further questions. Next slide, please. We are grateful for the research funding of the US Department of Energy, and in particular, we want to thank the Office of Strategic Analysis, the Solar Energy Technologies Office, and the Wind Energy Technologies Office for supporting this project. So, Will, please do take it away.
Unmute. Great. Thank you, Yo, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. We're excited to share with you kind of this whirlwind tour of a lot of our research. So just a quick presentation overview. I'm going to define hybrids and set a little bit of the scope for what our research has been at the lab, because hybrids can be somewhat of a nebulous or all-encompassing term. So I'll provide a little bit more clarity on that. I'll talk more about our motivations, why we think this research matters, why we think it's important to disseminate these findings broadly. And then I will go in to explain the first 5 of our top 10 findings before turning it over to Yo to conclude with the last 5 and then to summarize and conclude the presentation. As Yo mentioned, we hope to save 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end. I already see that someone has put a question in the Q&A feature, so that's great. Definitely encourage you all to do that as we continue to move through this presentation. All right, so how are we defining hybrids? So hybrids can sometimes be used, that term, to any project that combines multiple energy generation, storage, load control technologies. They don't necessarily have to be physically located. They could be virtually linked, like distributed energy resources in some aggregated form. So that hybrid terminology is used both in industry and academic reports with not necessarily a lot of precision. And so we think it's important for upfront for us to define what we mean, just to set the context for the remainder of the talk. So we define hybrids in our work as combinations of generation and storage, operated either as a single co-controlled and co-managed resource or as two separate units. But importantly, kind of the key feature is that our work is focused on projects that are sited at the same geographic location. So they might share some equipment, they should probably share some type of development process. And so that's how we're defining hybrids here. And so therefore our research, at least so far in our group, has not focused on sole combinations of generator types. So for instance, wind and solar being co-located. If that didn't have a battery or storage unit, it's not going to be the focus of our talk. We haven't done too much on exploring non-battery storage types, mostly because the commercial activity so far has been in lithium-ion batteries. That is not to say that our research can't be applied generally to storage technologies, because ultimately we are developing methods that deal with energy shifting, which is just a generic capability of storage. But a lot of the projects that we've reviewed empirically, and a lot of the ways we've set up scenario analysis in our work has been thinking about the lithium-ion battery in particular. And then finally, we don't look at virtual hybrid technologies or distributed hybrid technologies. We're really focused a lot at the utility scale, with the exception of one finding that Yo will mention at the very end. All right, so why does this research matter? Why were we motivated to put this all of these research projects together over the last 3 or 4 years? I think it's probably not news to this group that has joined this LBNL webinar, but one of the most important electric power system trends of the last decade was the rapid cost decline of wind and solar, and therefore the rapid deployment of standalone wind turbines and photovoltaic arrays, a trend that will be continuing into the future. But in this decade, in the last few years, what we've been seeing, those that have followed the industry more closely, is that hybrids and standalone storage are slated to become a common form of deployment, and have already become somewhat common, as I'll show here in a few slides. And this is really driven, one, by the recognition that there's growing needs for enhanced flexibility to balance variable renewable energy that was previously deployed on a standalone basis. But also with falling battery prices, cost synergies to co-deployment of batteries in solar and wind, and then also tax credits involved with hybridization, we see that also as a significant driver. So wind and solar had rapid cost declines 10, 15 years ago into the future, and now we're seeing that same thing happen with batteries. And so because of this rapid deployment, it's important to kind of study the issues, but in particular, since wholesale market rules, which have so far not necessarily included these types of hybrid resources, so they are under development, it's important to provide information on drivers, trends, costs and value, and challenges to deployment. Because as this last bullet says, ultimately combining characteristics of energy storage and conversion technologies imposes complex questions for grid operators and just general economic issues and industry interests. And so this is why we think this research broadly matters to the stakeholders in the industry. And so, as Yo mentioned, we have 13 reports that are roughly going to be summarized in the next 10 slides. This is a high-level summary of these findings that we will go through that cover issues from the growth to the market value and different capabilities and participation options and how they're currently actually being operated in the market. So we'll go through each of these findings. But one thing I want to say up front is just a word of warning. Usually we have a webinar that's 45 minutes that would go into maybe one report. Now we're going to try to cover 13 reports in some form or fashion. And so this is just all to say that we're not going to have a lot of time to go deep into each individual method and application when we go and summarize these findings. And we'll also be pivoting between concepts as we go from slide to slide. And so encourage you again to, if there is a particular finding that you want to know more details about the method, or you want it to be explained maybe a little bit better than we get in our first pass, really bring those up in the Q&A as we kind of make our way through these 10 slides. Great, so let's get into the findings. So the first is that a lot of the work that we do up at the lab is just following industry trends. And what we've seen, as I've said, is that developer interest in hybrid power plants is strong and growing. So on the left part of the slide, you see that we found that by the end of 2021, there were more than 8 gigawatts of PV and wind hybrid plants online. And on a cumulative basis, that operational hybrid capacity increased by 133% from 2020 to 2021. So it's really joining some exponential growth trends. We have a map that plots out some of the hybrids that we found across the United States. But one point I do want to make is you see that there is a lot of fossil hybrids that we have included on this map, but ultimately in the remainder of the presentation and the focus of our research has not been on those technologies. And that's typically because they include a relatively low amount of storage compared to the generation plant. And so help a little bit on the operational side of fossil, but not necessarily playing big energy shifting roles. And so it hasn't been the focus of our work. It also hasn't been the focus of our work because if you turn your attention to the right side of the graph, you will see what is being proposed in the interconnection queues across the United States. And these are pretty mind-boggling numbers. And so while more than 675 gigawatts of solar are being proposed, almost half, so 42% of that capacity is being proposed in hybrid form. That's a much larger percentage than you see in the wind category. And a little bit later in the presentation, I'll get to one of the reasons why that might be. But you see relatively smaller percentages in natural gas. So there's not as many of these fossil hybrids being proposed. All right, so a lot of our work, in addition to following just general industry interest, is to try to think about the price, cost of these hybrid technologies and the corresponding market value that a person or a purchaser of these technologies might get if they participate in our wholesale electricity markets in the United States. So I'm going to go from left to right on this slide. And on the left, what you see is a review that our colleague Mark Bollinger has done of PPA prices, both standalone PV and hybrid PV plus storage projects. The standalone projects are the filled in solid circles, and the hybrids are the circles that are not filled in. And what you can see are a few trends. So you can see that the cost decline of hybrid technologies has happened up to the point where hybrids now are being signed for PPA prices that standalone PV prices were being signed for and purchased back in 2015 and 2016. So pretty significant cost decline. You also see a difference in markets between Hawaii and markets in the continental US, which both could be because in Hawaii, it's often the case that there is a larger battery to PV capacity ratio. So there's generally bigger batteries being purchased in Hawaii. but also a key driver of PPA prices is the market competitiveness of alternative technologies. And in Hawaii, they are still reliant on fossil fuels that have to be purchased outside of the island. And so you can see that corresponding gap also being driven by just a difference in market characteristics. Moving to the middle chart, this now shows battery prices extracted from the PPAs that were reviewed for a subset of the PPAs that were reviewed in Figure 3. And the main point here is to show that as the battery size increases, as one would expect, the corresponding adder, so the premium that you would pay to add a battery to your PV plant goes up in a pretty linear fashion. And so on this slide, I want you to focus, or this Figure 4, focus on this 50% ratio and the $10 to $15 a megawatt hour of PV price adder, because that will be important as we move now to Figure 5, which is where we show results of a market optimization algorithm that we implement to calculate, like, let's say that you've purchased this PV plus storage hybrid plant, you're going to dispatch it in the markets. What type of value are you going to get? And what we found in California and Texas is that in our low kind of imperfect foresight algorithm, we found an increase of value of $13 a megawatt hour and $11 a megawatt hour when you add a battery. And in our perfect foresight algorithm, which is this high case, we find an even increasing value. And the key point here is to compare these numbers to that cost premium that we've been seeing in the PPAs. And you can start to see that there is, for the cost that people are buying, is starting to equate to the value that they might be seeing in the market, which is one explanation for why these projects have become more interesting to market players. But beyond just pure price and value comparisons, our research has also been interested in studying other drivers. And one of the projects that we looked at was trying to think about, okay, well, what if you wanted to site your battery at a really high value grid location? So a particularly congested region, which could be distinct from where wind and solar are the easiest to develop, or potentially the most profitable to develop given resource potential across the United States. And so we came up with an analysis that cited batteries at particularly high value locations on the grid and compared the value of that battery to a value of a battery that would be sited at wind and solar locations. And so that's what you see in this Figure 6, as we found that that default penalty, our baseline penalty, was $2.3 a megawatt hour. So battery developers might be sacrificing some amount of revenue if they co-locate this battery at a wind or solar location. But there are corresponding cost savings to doing this hybrid development jointly. So that's what I show here in these blue bars, is that we found that there are significant construction cost savings. So this is the shared inverter, sharing development on a given parcel of land, the overhead that goes with developing a project. All of those things can potentially be saved if you're developing this project jointly. You can see that just construction savings on its own outweigh this default penalty. But there is also been an investment tax credit that some of you might be familiar with. If the battery charges from that solar plant, it can claim that 30% ITC, which we estimate is also a very big cost savings that the developer of the project will receive. And that cost savings combined with the construction savings kind of exceeded all of the different scenarios that we analyzed when studying this coupling penalty. And so overall, the conclusion here was tax credits are definitely a driver of this hybrid technology, but they are not necessarily the only driver, as there are serious other cost savings. So far, I've been talking about hybrids in the context of price and value, but I haven't talked explicitly about different technological configurations that one might choose. And what I mean by configurations is the relative size of the battery capacity, how much battery duration it has, so how much energy is in the battery, what the inverter loading ratio may be on a solar coupled system, whether it's going to be AC or DC coupled. And there are a few other that if you go into the particular hybrid configuration choices report, you'll see more of. But we wanted to know, like, what should developers be thinking about when making these configuration choices? And what we found here in figure 7 is that battery duration and battery capacity have the largest impact on hybrid net value as compared to some of the other configuration choices that we looked at. And so if you look in this graph, what you see on the x-axis is battery capacity. What you see on the y-axis is hybrid net value. And so what we do is we apply similar optimization techniques that I mentioned on a few slides, where we have this hybrid system get dispatched against electricity prices across the 7 wholesale markets in the US, which are these 7 figures here. And then we calculate the costs of that corresponding configuration to determine this hybrid net value. And you can see that over all of the markets, as your duration goes up, we found that the net value goes down. And this basically is a finding that the additional costs that that increased duration would have do not outweigh the additional value that the market would provide. And so in general, we found storage durations of 1 to 4 hours would be, at least using historical prices, most optimal. And that's aligned with the current projects that we have observed have come online in the past and that are being proposed. The last point to make on this slide is that we found that region-wide solar penetration levels, so the total amount of solar energy in a given market, really drive solar hybrid value. And so I think one way to see this is if you look at this CAISO graph, you can see that even though as duration goes up, net value goes down, but as battery capacity goes up, the value is also going up. And this is one way of saying that, in California, the solar penetration is the highest and as compared to any of these corresponding markets. And we see that that duck curve that has now exists, so the net load being really low when solar is producing, and then ramping up when the sun sets, has equally led to this very nice arbitrage value of prices, where prices also get depressed in the belly of the duck and then go up exceedingly once the sun goes down. And that has a particularly advantageous effect on hybrid revenues. And so you can see that in some of our results, not just in this paper, but in a number of the papers that we've published on hybrids. All right, and the last thing that or the last finding that I will share before turning it back over to Yo is to start to talk in a little bit more detail about how hybrids are being engaged in electricity markets and what rules are being developed to get them integrated into electricity markets. So right now, there are 2 high-level market participation models that are being considered. And there's an image up here that describes these 2. On the left, these are separate independent resources. And that's a model that basically wouldn't require really any market rules to be changed, because market rules have been written for battery storage, market rules have been written for variable renewable energy. And even though these hybrids would be co-located, they basically would have separate telemetry and data flow to the ISO market interface, so the market dispatcher, and they would treat these units separately. There's definitely some benefits to this model. As I mentioned, the rules don't need to be updated too much to integrate these things. It also allows the renewable portion to also not get penalized for imbalance payments, because it would be treated as this uncontrollable variable resource. But at the same time, there would be some restrictions to co-controlling these plants, which an operator might want to do for various tax reasons, but also potentially for more information that they have on the configuration of their plant and potentially the forecasting of their plant. And so the other model being considered is the single self-managed resource, basically treating the hybrid as a traditional power plant that would be given that would give bidding parameters to the ISO or the market operator, and be dispatched like any other battery. So there's some benefits and some simplicity to treating these units as just a single power plant, but there's also some risks, both that the operator would take, because they would have to manage imbalance on their own of their renewable energy asset, but also some potential reliability risks, given that the ISO would not observe in as much detail the plants behind that point of interconnection. So ISOs and RTOs are continuing to work on these model details, focusing on these definitions and business practices. And there's been a desire to maintain openness to deciding which market participation model should ultimately get implemented, partly to facilitate innovation. And the challenges that these operators are going to be thinking through and have been thinking through include these topics that I've somewhat mentioned: forecasting, market power mitigation, given that now these technologies, they're somewhat distinct from the traditional fossil asset that has a calculatable marginal cost based on fuel, and then metering and telemetry issues. And so far, developer preferences have been somewhat mixed between these two models, but it will be an important trend to track in the future. And with that, I will turn it over to Yo to talk about the next 5 findings.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I've been trying to answer a couple of questions already on the side in the Q&A box, and would encourage you all to submit further questions if anything is unclear. Just put it in there. We try to answer some along the way or at the end. So thanks, Will, for the presentation so far. I'd like to talk now about the capacity value of hybrids. Electric system planners in general want to ensure that there's always adequate generation resources available to deliver electricity to loads in nearly all hours. And for the long-term planning, they assign capacity credits to individual generators that describe their relative marginal contributions to satisfying that accurate demand during the highest net load hours. The capacity contribution of these hybrid projects does vary by region, and it also depends on the configuration of the hybrids and operational constraints. But our group developed a fairly simple algorithm for calculating the capacity credit of hybrid plants that is suitable for exploratory analysis. And we find in particular that shared hybrid project infrastructure can cut cost, and that's a positive, but it may also reduce the capacity value of hybrids. The capacity contribution of standalone variable renewable energy resources tapers with increased penetration of them due to shifting demand patterns, and that can pose a barrier to future deep decarbonization. But coupling then these renewables with storage can mitigate this challenge and provide a pathway thus to more reliable, clean power at higher penetration levels. Many market operators and utility planners are currently very actively engaged in procedures that define how exactly these hybrid resources can contribute toward resource adequacy targets. Some widely trusted methods, like, for example, effective load carrying capability analyses, or ELCC, determine the capacity credit of individual resources, but they rely on very data-intensive and complex probabilistic models. And with these models, it can be quite difficult to explore changes in the capacity contributions across a wide range of configurations or operational constraints or regions or scenarios of future developments. And thus we developed and validated new approximation methods which are well suited to explore how capacity accreditation for hybrids may change in an evolving grid. The graph on this slide provides a nice example. The dark blue line here shows the capacity credit for a standalone battery, and it rises with its duration, reaching nearly 100% of capacity credit around 5 to 6 hours. A solar standalone project has a lower capacity credit. In our example, about 50% for a summer peaking utility and about 30% for winter peaking utility. The light blue line now shows the combined capacity credit of both a standalone battery and a standalone solar project, each with 100 megawatt capacity. But when infrastructure such as inverters or interconnection capacity at the POI is shared between both resources, it can limit the total available capacity, in our example, again, at 100 megawatt, and thus leave about 30 to 50 megawatts of capacity inaccessible. Operational constraints, such as charging the storage only from the local generator, can similarly lower the capacity contribution if periods of high risk occur primarily during low renewable production hours. On the plus side, shorter battery durations of 2 to 4 hours generally suffice to bring the hybrid's capacity credit to 100%, which is less than if you just have a standalone battery. Next slide, please, Will. I now want to turn to what seems to be a very lucrative market for hybrids, namely ancillary services. Our analysis shows that hybrid projects can unlock significant value from ancillary service markets, at least in some regions. But those ancillary service markets are quite thin and can become saturated by battery projects that are currently already in the interconnection queues. So expecting a lot of additional ancillary service revenues to offset maybe declining energy and capacity value over the long term may be a risky strategy for wind and solar hybrid project owners. As wind and solar energy supply a larger share of electricity generation, there is a growing interest really in enabling these resources to provide additional reliability services to the grid through the participation in ancillary service markets. And there have been a lot of studies demonstrating the capability of these resources to do so. This opportunity could also provide extra sources of revenue for hybrid project owners to offset the declines in the energy value. And it can provide system operators with access to low-cost reliability service and a new tool for addressing emerging system constraints. Our group estimated additional revenues here for hybrid solar and wind projects from participating in the ancillary service markets relative to energy markets alone. And we're focusing here on markets for regulation reserves, which typically have the highest prices among all the ancillary service products. And we find that participating in these markets can yield quite a lot of additional revenue, in some cases up to $33 a megawatt hour. The distinction between separate upward and downward regulation products in particular could enable a more efficient provision of regulation reserves by wind and solar and storage projects. And our research here suggests that independent system operators or regional transmission organizations may first want to prioritize the participation of these hybrid projects in ancillary service markets, given that they are a little bit more lucrative, really, or able to provide services. And then in a second step, consider how standalone wind and solar projects may be able to participate. Allowing renewables, though, to actively contribute to these markets in some form or fashion will be, I think, important for the deep decarbonization of the electric sector to come. But as with many things, supply growth can lead to market saturation and then an associated price decline, even in regions that at the moment seem to have high incremental value. And so the total regulation reserves in the US ISOs, just to provide some context, are a little less than 5 gigawatts, and spinning reserves a little bit more, about 8 gigawatts or so. But this compares to about 290 gigawatts of standalone and hybrid storage that is currently sitting in the interconnection queues of just these 7 ISOs at the end of 2021. Next slide, please, Will. We've so far discussed a lot of hypothetical values that hybrids can unlock when they are optimized for wholesale power markets. But the real world economic value is, of course, determined by what these hybrids really do in practice, or really what their operational dispatch strategies are in reality. And many models of solar and storage hybrid behavior, for example, often assume that these projects operators optimize the battery usage for wholesale power market revenue as merchant plants. And we've done so as well in a couple of our studies presented so far. But studying the empirical dispatch data from hybrid plants across the United States, we found that only a minority of the projects that were operational in the year 2020 really focused primarily on price signals that come from organized wholesale markets. And instead, they have many other price signals. For example, participants in special storage incentive programs, for example, the Massachusetts SMART program, really focus the timing of the dispatch based on the incentive payments. And I've provided an example here in the top left graph. Some load-serving entities or utilities try to reduce the exposure to capacity and transmission demand charges, and that is shown in the top right. And finally, large energy consumers, for example, jails or hospitals or manufacturers, really prioritize resilience and utility bill minimization and not wholesale power market price signals. These alternative business models can result in higher revenues for the individual project operators than participating alone in the wholesale power market. And in our sample, that can yield up to $150 per megawatt hour of generated solar. But these dispatch strategies do not necessarily optimize really the storage dispatch from a grid perspective. And what that would look like, we have shown here in this graph in the bottom half to kind of compare and contrast to the empirical dispatch. Because of that, because they're not following grid signals as much, at times they only yield stunted additional grid benefits. Understanding the prevalent battery charge and dispatch signals and aligning the current incentive structures with the actual grid needs is, I think, increasingly important as this hybrid sector grows. Similarly, we know that contractual requirements can restrict the flexibility of solar and storage hybrids, and that can in turn prevent optimal dispatch. So while often rooted in battery warranties or efforts to manage storage degradation, these other constraints and contractual requirements can nevertheless cause storage dispatch to diverge from what would be otherwise optimal based on wholesale power price signals. And finally, I'll now make a little mental leap and switch not from the large scale projects to smaller hybrid installations that are behind the meter of single family houses or small businesses. And here, net billing tariffs, which have become the predominant successor to net metering in much of the United States, provide reduced compensation for solar generation that is exported to the grid. And thus they encourage solar customers to install storage in order to shift solar production then to times when it can be self-consumed. But analyses by our group have shown that operating storage in this manner produces only very little value to the bulk power system as a whole, as those battery systems often tend to stand largely idle, especially in hours of peak system needs, and then they contribute only very little capacity value, which can be a primary value driver really. Next slide, please. So a few more words on distributed solar and storage hybrids. Roughly 30% of all the US battery storage capacity that has been installed through the end of 2020 was behind the meter, so small scale. And much of that was really paired with solar storage. Our group has an annual market report of small solar systems, and that allows us to characterize some key trends in the budding market. Solar storage attachment rates for residential solar have been steadily growing, as shown in this figure of this graph. But outside of Hawaii, they're really still just a very small share of the overall market, representing about 6% of the residential solar systems installed in the year 2020. And in the non-residential market, the number is even smaller. About 2% of solar systems installed in 2020 included storage. Many of those customers, when they are interested in storage, often really do this on a standalone basis. Most residential solar and battery systems include a single 5 kW battery that provides about 2 hours of storage, but more customers have recently sought to create greater backup capabilities, and thus it has become a little bit more common to install 2 or more of such batteries, growing to about 40% or so of all paired residential solar and storage systems that were installed in the year 2020. Nearly 50% of all the residential solar installers have installed at least one solar and battery system, but about only 20%, so much less, of the non-residential firms do so. That said, the residential market remains heavily concentrated. Tesla and Sunrun capture nearly 40% of the market, whereas in the non-residential space, the market has actually become less concentrated over time, and there are many more companies doing business here. Adding storage to behind-the-meter solar increases, of course, the total system price, and we found that it was about $1,000 or so per kilowatt hour of storage. And for a typical residential system, this can be quite hefty, adding about 30% premium to a standalone solar system. Among the residential installers that actually are most active and have installed the greatest number of solar and storage systems, we actually found that the median installed prices for these systems has increased in recent years, and that may reflect supply chain constraints as the demand for these new hybrids continues to grow. Next slide, please. So we, I think, have shown that hybridization of power plants can provide many opportunities to ease the challenges of balancing intermittent renewables. But its relative novelty means that there's still a lot of research needed to facilitate the integration of these new resources and promote further innovation. And evaluating the benefits and limitations of hybrid projects, I think, can be quite challenging due to the complexity of really combining multiple energy and storage and other conversion technologies. And so project developers, system operators, planners, and regulators may benefit from even better and more transparent data methods and tools to estimate the costs, values, and system impacts of hybrid projects. Hybridization may pose new risk, but it can, of course, also provide many new opportunities to the new energy systems. And a recent report by the US Department of Energy identified a couple of near-term opportunities for research and development for hybrid projects in particular. They found that technology R&D can develop and demonstrate new hardware and software that enables better co-optimization of hybrid resources. And then on the other hand, market policy and regulation research can develop frameworks that ensure efficient investment in and an operation of these hybrid projects. So then both research areas in conjunctions could yield refined valuation methods that quantify hybrid project costs and benefits in the electric system. Our group at Berkeley Lab will examine in particular how market designs will impact hybrid project dispatch, how it will impact system reliability, and the overall economic efficiency in future power systems. And we will also investigate how hybrid configurations may vary in response to transmission congestion. That's a study that we're currently doing. We furthermore plan to assess the capability of behind-the-meters solar and storage to provide backup power to end users during short and long duration power outages. And finally, in addition to these very targeted analysis, we are actively continuing to track and study hybrid deployment trends, both at the small residential and the large utility scale level. Next slide, please. So this presentation has been a bit like drinking from a fire hose, as we covered a lot of different research projects in only a very brief time. But I want to quickly summarize some key points. First, commercial interest in hybrid power plants continues to grow rapidly. Almost half of the 675 gigawatts of solar that is currently in the queues is at the moment being proposed to be coupled with with batteries. So the key drivers here are cost synergies, enhanced operational flexibility, and being able to use solar tax credits. The net value of these hybrids is positive in at least a number of regions in the United States, especially in California and in the Southwest. Second point, market prices help to explain key aspects of current market deployment trends, especially regional solar contribution levels that lower the value of standalone solar are driving the market value of hybrid projects. And recent market prices have incentivized, in particular, shorter duration batteries, but this may change again at higher contribution levels. And third and finally, hybrids are very attractive as they can engage with the electricity market really flexibly. The ancillary service markets are valuable, but it may be a fleeting opportunity. Many large-scale hybrid operators have so far focused on price signals that are not just the wholesale power markets, but coming from other sources. But this may change with growing market maturity. Also, contractual requirements and tariff design maybe needs to be adjusted to really capture the benefits of this flexible resource and not to prevent optimal dispatch of batteries. Next slide, please. And with that, I want to thank you very much for spending this time with us today. If you have any questions or recommendations or thoughts that you'd like to share with us, please feel free to contact either Will or me. Our details are posted here on the slide. You can also download again our summary paper from our website and find links there to the individual other research publications, as well as data assets and interactive visualizations. If you want to get alerted about new publication releases or new webinars, I'd encourage you to sign up to our email list. In general, we try to use it only sparingly to not clog up your inbox. But thanks again for taking the time to spend an hour with us today. And I'd now turn it to Will to see if we have any more questions.
Great. Thanks, Yo. And we do have a very rich Q&A discussion happening now. You've noticed that we've answered some of these already, but now we'll try to answer as many as we can live. I'll take 2 or 3 right now before giving Yo opportunity to pick out some of his own. But I do want to say, we're probably not going to be able to get through all of these in the 10 minutes we have left. And we do try to make an effort after the fact to review these and send emails if you have emails associated with your names. But I'll start. There have been a few questions about how value changes as solar penetration increases and why longer duration batteries and some of the configuration work that I was showing had net value that went down. So I'm going to answer both of those here. So in terms of solar penetration increases and how that relates to longer duration storage, we haven't really seen that, at least in the empirical work that we've looked at for market prices. And the main story here is that the intraday arbitrage opportunities that we've been seeing is very correlated with the diurnal solar profile. And so those peak prices, at least as I was mentioning with that net load, do not really last for longer durations than 4 hours. And so because of that, we usually see that having a 4-hour duration battery is enough basically to hit those peak price time periods. And so that's why longer storage durations, at least with historical prices. Now, our work was not future looking. And so if you look at other people's work that looks at, 80% renewable penetration, there is a story and need for longer duration. But again, our focus has been on more historical and near-term price trends. And so hopefully that explains a little bit about why our long duration batteries weren't as valuable. It's really because they don't need those longer durations given current price trends. Okay, so another question that I wanted, or that I saw that I wanted to answer. So I think actually came up in Yo's talk, but I've done some work on grid defection. But there was a point here that, when do you think grid tariffs and surcharges might lead to grid abandonment, given that there are these solar and storage technologies that have decreased in prices and potentially they could be more reliable. And that hasn't really been the centered focus of this work. But we have some ongoing projects, and some of our future work is to spend a little bit more time evaluating the reliability capabilities of behind the meter solar and storage to meet customer demand. And what we found there is that it can be a geographically distributed story, in the sense that HVAC and electric heating can oftentimes be really serious drivers of demand, and it can be hard, in particular for a solar and storage system, for instance, to meet demand during the winter months when there's not as much solar, but if you have electric heating, there's high demand. And so I think this grid defection story is really weather dependent. So we're in the Bay Area here. We generally have good weather year round, and therefore we don't have serious HVAC loads. But that's not going to be true for all customers. So I think I would have some hesitancy or caution when thinking about that grid defection story. And maybe I do have another one, but maybe Yo, I will give you an opportunity to field some questions.
Yeah. So on the topic of distributed solar, there was a question whether or not we do consider the fact that energy prices are higher towards the end of the day at 8 to 9 p.m. or so, and whether or not storage systems that would be discharged would not yield significant value there. And yes, that is true. And it kind of all depends how the residential battery is operated, right? If currently our time of use tariffs that we have in California and do try to mimic wholesale power price patterns a little bit, but they are much less granular. And they don't vary really from one day to the other. So I think what is kind of the key point is that as long as residential operators just dispatch their individual storage systems against relatively inflexible and non-dynamic tariffs that are just the same, the entire season, you're not able to really react spontaneously to grid events as they occur on a kind of hour-to-hour basis. And that just leaves a lot of additional value on the table, which you would otherwise be able to unlock if you have some kind of third-party aggregator or so who could really actively use those systems. From a private perspective, it does make sense because especially in some territories, like down in San Diego, the price differential between the low TOU and the high TOU period can be quite enormous. And so you are able to, get quite a bit of additional revenue as a residential system or a system operator. But from an overall macro grid perspective, you would probably be able to use these assets in a better way. A second question came up about capacity contributions of these hybrids and whether or not our finding that coupling solar with storage leaves some capacity on the table, whether or not that is in conflict with some other studies. There was a link to an E3 paper, which I think is excellent. I love that E3 study. And I want to be careful that we're understood here correctly. Overall, E3, a consulting company, found that there's a portfolio effect that adding solar and storage in conjunction can overall really help each other out by solar shifting residual net load into a shorter time period at the end of the day, and then storage is able to better address that. And so these two resources really play in conjunction to help each other out. And we're not arguing with that at all. I think we all agree with that. What we just wanted to show is that as soon as you put solar and storage assets behind shared infrastructure, and there is somewhat of a bottleneck, for example, your interconnection capacity, which would be costly to maximize. So if you have a 100 megawatt solar project and a 100 megawatt battery project, if you try to get your interconnection agreement to 200 megawatts, that can be quite a lot of additional investment that is needed. And so if you put it just behind a single 100 megawatt interconnector, that can then limit your flexibility, and you may not be able to get out of these systems as much as if they were decided completely separately. That was the primary point that we wanted to make there. Finally, there was one point, well, I'm not quite sure whether you already responded to that, about some non-ISO regions like the Pacific Northwest, where IUs increasingly find capacity needs in the future that are longer than 4 hours, and so that the capacity value of longer duration batteries may not be zero, but may be quite significant in the future timeframe. And as I read it, I realize you probably have responded to this already, because we've only looked so far at recent historical prices and not done these very forward-looking analyses, where I think many do expect that longer duration batteries can yield more value, which is why we see in some RFPs requests for longer duration batteries already.
Well, yeah, I one other response to this, which I think is important. I think this question was also referring to the capacity contributions slide, and the challenge again of this presentation is we couldn't go into all of those methods, but that work was in Florida. So that Florida has a particular load shape solar resource potential that could be very different than what's in the Pacific Northwest. So the important part of that work is the method that was developed to estimate capacity contribution, but we would expect that the outcomes to be quite different depending on where you are in the country as well. So that's just kind of an important caveat and context to know that the Florida system could be different, or definitely is different than Pacific Northwest. So how much time? Well, we are somewhat at time. So maybe I'll close it out now. I know we have a minute, but I would like to at least say thank you for all of you joining us today and having a bunch of questions in the Q&A. As researchers, it's always great when we have engagement from folks on the other side of the screen. And so really appreciate that. As I mentioned, I know we didn't get to a lot of these questions. So a lot of them are good ones. We will try to follow up when we can, but also if there is another question you guys have, or and you want to reach out to us, we're very open to talking and responding via email. So really do encourage ongoing engagement with our work. We really enjoy that. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a good day.